You're listening to the Maritime Gardening Podcast brought to you by Vessi Seeds. Well, folks, today we've got Rpbert Pavlis here to talk about potted plant repotting myths. Who is Rpbert Pavlis? He's got a Master of Science in Chemistry and Biochemistry. He's a master gardener with over 50 years of experience, an award-winning author of about a dozen gardening books. He might be beyond that number by now. These are notes I wrote at least a year ago. He has written articles for many popular magazines, teaches numerous gardening courses, a man of science, a myth buster, and a speaker of truth, Rpbert Pavlis. Rpbert, say hello.
Hi, how are you? It's good to be here again.
Did I get that right? A dozen
Yeah,
books, or are you
yeah,
beyond a dozen yet?
I think it's 14 now.
14. Holy smokes. And what's the name of the most recent book?
The food science for
Oh,
garden.
yes.
Uh, yeah,
I
and
think
then actually that's the last one that was published. And then I also did an ebook on growing great tomatoes.
an ebook on growing great tomatoes. Well,
Yeah,
we'll have to have you on to talk about one of those sometime soon. I feel like you must have sent me the food
I'm pretty,
science book.
yeah, I'm pretty sure we
Must have done.
did,
Yeah. Okay. I'll
and I
have to
don't
look
think
for it.
we've just ever discussed it.
No, so I've not had, and that's the topic near and dear to my heart. So definitely we'll have you on to talk about that for sure. We should do that soon. But today, talking about repotting myths. A lot of, I'm a guy who plants things in the ground. You plant a lot of things in the ground. I have very few things in pots, but I do some things in pots. But many gardeners, they can only grow things on pots for whatever reason. They only have a deck, or they're just scaling down, or it's easier, or more convenient, or what have you. But there's lots of things that people think they should be doing that maybe they don't need to do, or things they don't think they should do that they should do. So, what do you what do you got for us there, Rpbert? Hey, folks, apologies. We had some technical issues in recording this podcast. There's the odd spot for the first 20 minutes of the podcast where Rpbert cuts out due to a connectivity issue. I tried to edit it out as best as I could, but there's a couple of spots where it's a bit garbled and it's a little bit hard to follow. But then we clear it up and sort of fix the problem going on from there. So sorry about that. We'll get it right the next time.
All right, well, we'll and talk about them. I find try about repotting plants that really don't make a lot of sense if you kind of watch your plants and understand your plants. So there's lots of different kinds of house plants, and then people come up with these sort of standard rules. The first one is don't repot in winter or when plants are dormant. Now, it is true that our house plants don't grow as much in winter, but for many of them, that's because we don't give them enough light. In nature, many of our houseplants are tropical plants and they pretty much grow all year long. But of course, there are exceptions. So things like cactus, they grow during the summer months and they do take a rest in winter. And there's no reason why you can't repot in winter. I don't really understand that. In fact, if you think about it, if you take a plant that's actively growing and you repot it, you're going to do some damage to the root system and the plant. But if it's dormant and you repot it, you're really not doing any damage to the plant because it's dormant anyways. It's not doing anything. So if you damage a bit of roots, the plant doesn't really care.
Mm.
For most plants, they're fine. If you do the repotting properly and carefully, you're not going to stress the plant very much. And it doesn't really matter when you do it. I generally do it whenever it suits me rather than the plant. But there's nothing wrong with repotting dormant plants.
That makes perfect sense. If you look at, if you were going to move a fruit bush, uh, you wouldn't move it in July. That would be the worst thing
That's
you could possibly do, right?
that's right. Yeah, if you're an outdoor gardener, you do everything around here in early spring or in fall, right? We
Yeah.
don't do things in summer when things are actively growing because
No,
it does too much damage to the plant.
punish to the plant. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Myth number two is don't use large pots. Now, this one's kind of interesting. A lot of people will say, well, you get your little plant and it's in a small pot, and then when you repot it, you should go one size up. That used to be a very common rule. And then the next time you repot it, you go another size up, and so on. So the question is, does a plant really care? Can I take a plant from a small pot and put it in a big pot? Does that cause problems? And the bottom line is, no, it doesn't. In fact, in general, plants are happier in larger pots. Now, there's a caveat here, and that we have to adjust our watering to the growing conditions, right? So if a plant is in a large pot, it doesn't dry as fast. It doesn't use up the water as fast. So you have to water less. So if you take a plant in a small pot and you're watering every 3 days and you move it to a big pot, well, you might only have to water every 7 days or 10 days.
Mm,
So you do have to adjust your watering to the pot that the plant is in. And if there's a lot of soil and very small root system, well, the water's going to hang around, so you water less. But that's actually an advantage to a gardener because now it's less work.
yeah.
In general, most plants do just fine in a large container. Now, there are, again, exceptions with everything. If you're trying to grow a bonsai, for instance, we don't want to put that in a large pot because it's able to develop a large root system and then it grows more above ground. And we don't want that. The whole point of having a bonsai is we're trying to limit its growth, right?
Right.
So in that case, you don't want a big pot.
Right.
Now, recently I've been growing Streptocarpus, and I've been growing them for about 3 years now. And one of the golden rules for Streptocarpus is don't put it in a big pot because they stay too wet. And I've done that now. I've taken one and put it in quite a large pot to see what happens, and it's doing just fine. Most people report that the plant rots and just dies.
If you overwater it,
Well,
that,
it gets back to the watering issue,
yes.
right? If you used to watering every second day and you put it in a big pot and you still water every second day, and that's too wet. So
Yeah.
as long as you adjust your watering, then it doesn't really matter. And in general, plants will grow better and faster in a large pot because there's more root space. So they can spread out their roots and get nutrients easier. And so in general, most house plants do better in a big pot.
Well, it makes, I mean, to think the larger the pot, the more closely you're simulating it actually being in the ground. You know,
Yeah,
where there's like
that's
unlimited water and unlimited space and unlimited nutrients sort of thing. So it
yeah.
makes sense. Even I've got two plants at my office where I work. I've got an aloe and I've got a mint plant. I used to have a spider plant, but I switched to mint. And yeah, the pot's always the same. It's like, the pot is the size I expect the plant to be when it's fully grown.
Mhm.
But so I put an aloe in there in 2020, and last, I don't know, just before the fall, I had like, it's a pot about 6 inches in 6 inches in diameter, and it was just packed with aloe right after 5 years of that.
Right.
So I just took them all out and put one back in. And
Hmm.
now I got about six growing there, and but it's the same, a small pot with one plant. The same thing with the mint. I put I'm a 6 inch pot and there's like one piece of mint in it.
Right.
And it's gonna, it's doing great. It's happy as can be. Like you say, I mean, I stick my finger in it, and if it's wet, I don't water it. When I
Yeah.
stick my finger in and it's dry, like, so you don't water on a schedule, you water by feel. So everything you're saying makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. The same rule applies to seedlings. There are a
Right.
lot of people who think that seedlings need to go from a small pot to a slightly larger
Yes,
pot to a
transplants.
slightly
Yeah.
larger pot, and that's not necessary. You can plant the seed in a pretty big pot and grow that up until you go outside, and then you don't have to transplant, right?
Yes, that makes perfect
On
sense.
the flip side, though, you may want to use smaller pots like you're doing. You're trying to control the size of this plant because when the plant has more soil, it likes to grow bigger, and you may not want it to be bigger, right?
Yeah,
So there are reasons for not going to a big pot, but understand that a big pot isn't going to harm your plant.
that makes sense.
Yeah. This is another one that I find very funny is you don't have to throw out potting soil. And there's so many people, not so much for house plants maybe, but certainly containers that are outside. So people go out and they buy potting media or potting soil. They fill their containers, they plant in it, and then next spring they throw it all away or throw it on a compost heap or into their garden and get fresh stuff so that their plants will grow again. And this never made any sense to me, and there's really no reason for doing this. We have to understand that soil doesn't get old. And it doesn't matter if it's real garden soil or it's potting soil. Now, most of our potting soil isn't real soil, right? It's peat moss or coir, or these days you get more wood products in there, decomposed wood. But none of those things are real soil. And none of those get old. I mean, they sort of last forever. Now, the one thing that does happen to our artificial soils is that they break down. And so if you start with large chunks of wood in it, it doesn't get smaller and smaller and smaller. So the same thing happens with peat moss. So fresh peat moss is quite airy and the particles are quite large and there's a lot of air spaces between them. But as the material starts breaking down, then we have less air spaces and it does compact a bit. So we have to understand that. We may need to adjust for that and we can put in something like perlite or sand or something to loosen it up again. But it doesn't get old. I mean, I have an outdoor container that I grow a clematis in it, a small spring flowering clematis called alpina. And it's been in the same container for 10 years and I've
Right.
never changed the soil. Now, if that original material had a lot of compost in it, you might want to add some more compost. And in house plants, if you're dealing with hard water, then the hard water tends to form a crust on the surface. And so you might scrape some of that off because roots don't really like that hard water.
Mm.
But for the most part, you can reuse it and just keep using it over and over again. Provided that the porosity is there, the pot is draining the way the plants want. There's no reason to throw it out.
Right, and that would save people money. Could people also take, like, let's say you had a plant die, so you've got a pot full of soil and there's some roots in it. They could just take that, put it in a big bowl, take all the roots out and stuff like that, add a little bit of fresh soil, stir it all around and put it back in the pot sort of thing. And
Yeah,
yeah,
that works fine. In fact, you don't even have to take the roots out.
right.
If we think about this, what we do is we go out and buy this fancy soil and then we go out and buy some compost and add to it because we know the compost is good for growing plants.
Yes.
Well, what is compost? It's
Right.
rotting plant material. Right? So you don't have to take the old roots out. Those roots will just start decomposing and turn into compost. So there's nothing wrong with leaving the roots in there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Um, Another thing that people find is sometimes they find mushrooms growing in their potting media, and they get all concerned about that. Well, those
Mm.
mushrooms are just using up the organic matter that's in there. That's what they're growing on. And what I tell people is, enjoy that mushroom for the 2 days it's there, and then it disappears.
Mm.
And mushroom spores and so on will fill the pot and the fungi in there grow in the soil and that's all good for plants. It's not going to do any harm whatsoever.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I don't even take the roots out for the most part. Now, if they're big chunks, you might take them out just so it's easier to plant in, but the plant you're putting in probably doesn't care.
Yeah, yeah.
Myth number four, don't fertilize after repotting. This one is actually very common. The other place you hear this is, again, we take seeds or tiny seedlings and we pot them for a while. And to some extent, this makes some sense. And the reason is that some of these potting medias have fertilizer added to it.
Yes.
And so the thinking is, okay, you bought this material, has fertilizer, so you don't need to fertilize. And sometimes on the bag it even says, it's good for 3 months, don't fertilize. Um, so I did a little review of this. In fact, just recently I wrote a new blog post about this, and I asked the question, how much fertilizer are they putting in there? And, how long does it last? And the bottom line is that, first of all, these manufacturers don't give you enough information to allow you to answer that question. And the second thing is most of them recommend that you start fertilizing fairly quickly, even if they do add some fertilizer.
Hmm.
So here's a couple scenarios and the problems with them. So some of these manufacturers will put in synthetic fertilizer. So this is very soluble. So I pot up my plant, I water it, the fertilizer dissolves, it's there. That's great. But the next time I water, if I water properly, I'm pushing some of that water out the bottom of the pot, right? You always want to overwater so some drips out the bottom. That washes these salts and things out. Well, in no time at all, there's no fertilizer in the pot because you've washed it out. So you have to fertilize those. It doesn't last very long. Now, there are other manufacturers who put in slow release fertilizer, so
Hmm.
a synthetic slow release. So these are little beads, and they're designed to add a little bit of fertilizer every time you water. So those last a bit longer, and you can buy these fertilizers with different expirations. So you can buy them like they're good for 30 days or 3 months or 6 months. I think you can even buy them up to a year. The problem is most manufacturers don't tell you which ones they bought, so you don't really know what they're adding. But those will provide nutrients a little bit longer. The third group of companies, they add organic material. And in that article, I reviewed several manufacturers. In fact, I talked to a couple of them. And one of them I contacted and I said, can you tell me how much fertilizer you're putting into your product? And they came back and said, well, we don't put fertilizer in our product. And I said, well, just a minute. Like you put blood meal and bat guano and feather meal and so on. I said, those are organic fertilizers. Oh, he says we put those in, but we don't consider them to be fertilizer. So we're not going to tell you how much we add. We're not going to tell you what the NPK, how much is in there, and how long do they last? Right? In fact, I asked them for a study. I says, can you show me a study where you this and seen how it changes over time? And they weren't able to provide that. And that's the problem with organic fertilizers. We never know how much nutrients are actually coming out of organic material. Right? So my take on this is really simple. You fertilize. If I put fertilizer on there, I know the plants are getting fertilizer.
Hmm.
And the amount that's in there is generally very low, and it's not going to last very long anyways.
Hmm.
So I fertilize everything. And that goes for seedlings too. A lot of people say, well, you don't have to fertilize seedlings. And that's true up until the plant starts making the first true leaf. As long as it's making the cotyledon leaves, which are the first ones you see, you
Hmm.
don't have to fertilize because the nutrients come from inside the seed.
Yes.
But once that seedling starts making the true leaves, it needs nutrients from somewhere,
Hmm.
and you might as well provide it for it. Myth number 5, add drainage to the bottom of the pot. Well, this is a really interesting story, and I like this story because it teaches us something about plants and pots, but it also gives us really good insight into science and how science works. All right, so let me take you back, let's say 25 years ago.
Yep.
Uh, Everybody was putting stuff in the bottom of their pots.
I mean, like
Uh,
rocks and stuff.
Rocks, pot shards. Back 25 years ago, we were all using clay pots, so they would break, and we'd break them up into little pieces, and we put those shards in the bottom of the pot. Anything very porous. And then we put the potting media on top, and the reason we did that was because it increased drainage in the pot.
Hmm.
It meant that the soil in the pot wasn't too wet. The excess water would run out the bottom because it was sitting on these pebbles. And that makes so much sense, right? That just like you can have a room full of gardeners and you tell them that, they all shake their heads. Yes, yes, I understand. This makes perfect sense. Well, it turns out that we changed the story. And let's call it 15 years ago. We started telling people that this is a big hoax. This isn't true.
Mm,
Okay? This material in the bottom of a pot does not increase drainage. In fact, what happens is that we create something called a perched water table. And this is and actually that term is incorrect. Perched water table actually means something different. We have a layer right above that that gets super saturated with water, and that's the perched water table. And what happens is that if I have a pot with pebbles and one without, and I compare the two, what I've really done is I've raised the perched water table. They both have a perched water table, and it's about the same size. It has the same height, but one is higher up in the pot because it has pebbles underneath.
hmm
It didn't get rid of the perched water table. It didn't change the perched water table. It's still there. We've just raised it. Well, that's not good for plants because now, in effect, what you've done is made the pot smaller. There's less
hmm
soil in the pot. The bottom inch or so is this perched water table, which is really wet. And then we have less soil above, so the plant has less place to put its roots. That's not good for plants. So about 15 years ago, we started telling everyone, don't put stuff in the bottom of your pots. It doesn't increase drainage. It doesn't get rid of this perched water table, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, did anyone ever look at any of the science behind this? Well, it turns out the answer is no. No one's actually ever studied this. This was just stories that let's call them senior gardeners, experienced, trusted gardeners started saying, and we all repeated it. And I've told hundreds of gardeners, don't put gravel in the bottom of your pot. It doesn't work. Well, interestingly, about a year ago, someone actually decided to test this.
hmm
And they actually measured the amount of water that's in these pots. And I reviewed the research that person did, and it's quite an interesting study. But what they showed was that pebbles in the bottom of a pot decreases the amount of water in that pot. They actually work. The soil is drier. It doesn't hold as much water when we put pebbles in the bottom.
I can see that.
So the science, which is only like a year too old, maybe a year and a half now, shows that pebbles work. We should put drainage material in the bottom of a pot if we want to reduce the amount of water in that pot.
Right.
Now, the person who did the research, he's both a scientist and a hobbyist who grows plants, and he's not suggesting that we start putting pebbles in the bottom of all our pots.
Mm,
We have to understand why we're doing that. So, for instance, I want better drainage, so I could put pebbles in the bottom, but I could do something different. I could my potting media and add a little vermiculite, pearl vermiculite, but either one do and something large water that this soil holds by changing the soil itself. So he's not suggesting we start using these pebbles. He's suggesting that we mix something into our soil if we need it. So for instance, if you get a medium that's very dry, and so you put a whole bunch of sand and you solve the problem that way as opposed to putting rocks at the bottom of the soil. But it just shows that a lot of the things that we believe in gardening and have for many, many years may not actually be true because science has never actually studied it. And this is a good example of it.
I could see. I mean, I could see definitely just on the principle of what's that like capillary reaction. If you've got a flower pot with soil all the way down and it's sitting in a dish, right?
Yeah,
You fill it up and the water goes right through it and it fills up the dish. But then if there's no rocks in the bottom, the soil should be able to suck that. Eventually it'll absorb back up. But if
right.
there was like 2 inches of rocks in the bottom, uh, it's possible the water might never go back up into the soil, just get absorbed. So I could see that. Um, I would say one reason to put rocks in the bottom of a flower pot is if it's windy, to
Ah,
lower the center of gravity.
yeah, and so there are
Just put a
some
big
good
rock in there.
reasons. If you're having these outside in windy areas, then we want them heavier.
Yeah, yeah.
The next method is number 6, and that's misting your plants after repotting.
Mm,
And this one actually goes for misting at any time. I see this advice all the time. If your plants need more humidity, mist them. And for the most part, just doesn't work. And you can see this yourself. Take a misting bottle, mist the air around your plants. You'll see little droplets sitting on the plants, and then time them to see how long those droplets disappear. The reason the droplets are disappearing is because that water is evaporating into the air. And while that's going on, the humidity around that leaf goes up. But as soon as the droplet is gone, as soon as it's dried up, the humidity's gone as well. What you have to remember is that this moisture that we spray in the air doesn't stay around the plant. It very quickly moves throughout the whole room. And once the droplets are gone, your humidity is gone. So I tell people, yeah, misting works, but you kind of have to do it like, every half hour or so, day and night, and then misting works. Other than
Right,
that, it really doesn't do much good.
right. Yeah. You're probably
Um,
just delaying the plants adapting to your particular environment.
yeah. If the plant really does need high humidity after it's been transplanted. So, for instance, I mentioned I grow streptocarpus. So sometimes I'm dividing them and I get a division that has almost no roots on it. I'll pot that up, and then what I do is I put it inside a baggie.
Hmm.
So if you put it inside a closed environment, then it has high humidity all the time. You have to have a little moisture in there, but not too much. But if you spray it inside the baggie and close the baggie, it'll stay humid for days.
Hmm.
So that will work. But the truth is that if you're just repotting a plant, we're not doing any major damage to the root system. We're not cutting it apart. We're not splitting it and so on. And it still has a decent root system when you repot it. It doesn't need high humidity. It will just continue growing in wherever humidity you were growing it in.
Hmm.
The same goes for pebble trays, which is a very common advice. So if your plant needs more humidity, put it on a pebble tray. And that doesn't work either. If you measure the humidity right above the pebble tray, it does have a higher humidity. But once you get about 4 or 5 inches above that pebble tray, there's no change in humidity.
Mm.
Right? By the time it gets up to where the leaves are on most plants, it has the same humidity as the rest of the room. So
Mm.
it really doesn't do any good.
I see.
If your plants need more humidity because that's what they need to grow, then you have to give them that humidity. You have to increase the humidity in the whole room, or at the very least, have a lot of plants huddled close together.
Mm.
Right? So plants are constantly taking water from the soil through their roots and it comes out of their leaves. So this constant movement of water from roots to leaves and into the air. So by putting plants close together, each plant helps humidify the plant around themselves. So that does work. If you have 10
Mm.
plants together, they will have more humidity than just one plant.
Right. Yeah.
But the
Makes
real
sense.
solution is to just increase the humidity in the whole room.
Mm. Right.
And again, this has nothing to do with repotting. In most cases, repotting does not require you to increase humidity on the plants. Um, Another one that I found really odd was if you see visible roots, it means you have to repot this plant right away. It's supposed to be a sign that it's repotting time.
Do you mean visible roots
Uh,
like
it's-
at the top or like underneath coming out the bottom?
well, they don't really specify,
I
but
see.
I think most of them probably come out the bottom.
Mm.
Right? So the pot is now full of roots. I think the thinking is that, when I have lots of roots in here, they are looking for places to grow, and they grow out of the holes in the bottom of the pot, and then we see the roots, and so that tells me inside the pot is crowded, so let's repot them. Um, in general, this is not really true either. Now it could be. So if I have a root bound plant and the whole inside of the pot is full of roots, then they're more likely to come out the bottom. So it may be a good time to pot, but I wouldn't call it urgent. You
Mm,
maybe should have repotted this a while ago.
mm,
Or quite honestly, most plants just do quite fine like that. They can be quite root bound and still do well.
mm,
There are other examples where seeing the roots actually doesn't tell you anything about repotting, and the orchids are a very common one. So if people are buying orchids and these, particularly these Phalaenopsis orchids that are very common at grocery stores and nurseries now, they naturally produce aerial roots. And so the roots will come out of the pot, and that's okay. Those roots can actually absorb moisture from the air, and they just naturally will come out. Now, most of
mm.
them will go into the pot because it's wetter there, but a few will come out, and that's just fine. That's not a sign that you need to repot your orchids.
I see.
A plant I grow is called Anthurium, and it's actually my wife's plant. She's had it for years. It's a plant that makes these green leaves, and then it'll make what looks like a red leaf, and it has a little spadix in the middle of it.
Mm,
And they last on the plant for a long time. The leaf itself is really, I think, a kind of bract, and the flower is inside of that. It's a nice plant because you just see this red for a very long time. But it's somewhat similar to a poinsettia.
mm,
And this plant also makes aerial roots. So as the plant gets taller and taller along the stem, it starts making these roots that grow out into the air.
mm,
They're usually not very long, but they can be an inch or two in length, and that's fine too. So don't be too concerned about the roots that you see. If you are, what I would do is turn the whole thing upside down and take the pot off and have a look at the roots.
mm,
You don't damage the plant by doing that. In fact, it's a great way to go and buy plants, both house plants and garden plants. I would recommend that every plant you buy, you turn it upside down, take the pot off, and have a look at the roots. It tells you a lot about the health of the plant.
mm,
If it's root bound, you'll see that you have a ton of roots. And so this plant should have been repotted a while ago.
mm,
Okay, you're not buying a top quality plant.
mm,
Now you can take that home and grow it just fine. It's not necessarily a problem, but maybe you shouldn't pay full price.
mm,
On the other hand, you look at it and you don't see any roots. That's not a good sign either because either the roots have rotted or it's been very recently potted and it has a very small root system. So again, you're not getting a top quality plant. Most plants, both house plants and garden plants, if you take the pot off, you should see some roots, and they will probably be on the outside of the root ball, but it's not solid root. So you'll just
mm.
see some of them. And in most cases, they're healthy white or whitish roots.
Right.
Interesting, my Streptocarpus, its healthy roots are actually quite brown. So because the roots are not white doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with them. But for most of our plants, if you see brown roots, they're rotting. That's not a good sign for roots.
Mm.
Mhm.
What if you're in the store and you tip the pot up and the soil just goes everywhere? Should you just get the hell out of there?
Well, it shouldn't
Mm.
because they shouldn't be selling plants like that. So
Right,
if the plant should have been repotted a while ago and grown long enough to grow decent root system before they try to sell it to you.
right, right.
And
So,
once it has, some roots in there, it holds the soil in there quite nicely. It usually doesn't fall out like that.
right, right.
Um, and in the many years of doing it, I've never had one person come along and say, "Hey, I don't want you doing that in my store."
Hmm. Wow,
Right?
I have to try that. That's a neat,
Um,
yeah.
I mean, if I'm buying a plant on sale, I'm not quite so fussy. But if I'm paying full price for a plant, I want a good root system. Why would I
Mm,
buy one with rotten roots?
that
Right?
makes sense. Makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, myth number 8. Plants should always be repotted into a bigger pot. We sort of touched on this on the other one. You take your plant and I'm repotting it and it's grown in size and now I give it a bigger pot. And next time I do this, I give it a bigger pot and so on. And then the pot gets bigger and bigger. And So the answer to this is, well, that really depends. That's not a rule you should follow. This Santherium that I mentioned, we've had it for, I don't know, my blog post here says 30 years, which could very well be right. Um, it's in the same size pot I bought it in. I mean, it never gets a bigger pot.
Mm,
What I do is this is the one that makes kind of aerial roots, right? So I let it grow and it gets taller and taller and taller. It's not a fast growing plant. My wife also doesn't fertilize it enough, so it doesn't grow fast. But it does really well and it grows taller. And then at some point we look at it and say, the bottom's getting very bare, the leaves are all at the top, and I just come along and I just hack it off and I
mm,
literally cut it somewhere above grade, stick that whole piece back into the soil, let those area roots turn into normal water roots in the soil, and away it goes. And it sits there for about a month or so, and then it starts growing and it's happy again. But it's in the same pot that it's always been in. We don't go to bigger pots. Orchids is another good example. The Phalaenopsis orchids that people grow never need more than a 6-inch pot.
mm,
Okay, that's the biggest pot it will ever need. The plants actually grow vertical, and so it doesn't really spread sideways. It grows vertical, and you don't want a big pot for those because those roots do need a lot of air around their you need a lot of air around their roots for them to grow well.
mm,
So you don't go to bigger and bigger pots. Um, if you want to grow a plant larger, then a bigger pot will help, right? But if you want to keep it the same size, then put it back in the same pot. What that means is you might have to cut off some of the roots because if I've had this growing in, let's say, a 6-inch pot, and it's been in there a while. It's going to have a lot of roots in there, and I take it out, and it doesn't really go back into a 6-inch pot with new soil because it just isn't room for soil in there. It's got so many roots. So I may have to hack off some of the roots to get it back in there, and
mm,
that's okay. You don't want to hack all of them off, but some of them will be okay. But it's not a problem going back into the same pot.
mm. Yeah, it makes sense. You want it to be a certain size, so just yeah, cut off the top, remove some of the bottom,
Yeah.
stick it
Um,
back in. Yeah,
Just stick it back in. I mean, that's
yeah,
basically what you did with the plants you mentioned that you had on
yeah,
the windowsill, right?
exactly what I did.
You,
Yeah.
you, you, if it gets too big and you want to put it in the same pot, you might have to cut off some of that plant material, divide it, right? Get rid
Oh
of
yeah. A year from now, when that mint has completely
some.
filled the pot, I'll take it out. I'll cut it into like sixths,
Yeah,
toss 5/6 of it into the ditch or something, and then put 1/6 back in. Like
right.
yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
well, and with some like mint, you could even take cuttings and root them either in soil or water and then start a whole new plant and just throw
Yeah,
the old one away.
exactly.
Sometimes that's easier than to repot a big overgrown plant.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, quicker,
Yeah.
easier. Just like aloe. Just take one of the babies out.
Yep.
Exactly.
All right. Well, myth number 9, don't remove existing roots. All right, let's go back and think about this plant. So most plants have a root system below ground that is balanced with the amount of top growth. Now, that doesn't mean that the size of the top and bottom are the same, but they're balanced. So if we take away roots, then the top part suffers and it usually stops growing until it regrows those roots because it needs
Mm,
a certain amount of roots for a certain number of leaves on the top. And so those are always in balance. And we can come in and we can remove roots. It will slow down the growth of the plant. And the top part, you might lose some of the leaves. They'll go yellow and drop off because the roots can't support them, and the plant uh, is able to deal with that. But there's nothing wrong with taking away roots. What you have to understand is what happens to the plant, right? So this plant is getting water and nutrients through the root system, and it's made a root system that is the right size to get enough water and nutrients to support the above ground growth. It doesn't make bigger root systems. Plants don't make huge root systems for a tiny top part. Okay, this doesn't happen. It doesn't go the other way either. You don't get big top parts with tiny roots. They're balanced.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you have one of these plants and you want to get rid of some roots, that's fine. It's usually a good idea to also get rid of some of the top part. So you can cut some excess leaves off, that works. Or in the case of your plant, you divided it, so you kind of got rid of some of the top growth, right? You have to understand that. Now, you don't have to do that. You can just cut off some of the roots and put it back in the pot, but then understand that the plant may fix itself. So it may drop some leaves that are above ground,
Mm,
or it certainly will stop growing for a little while until the roots catch up.
mm,
But you're not going to kill the plant. I mean, I don't know of any plant that you would just kill by doing that.
mm.
So
Yeah,
don't be afraid. If it's root bound, it's a good idea to cut off some of those roots and replant it.
I was just planting some tomato transplants the other day, planting them in the garden, and I dropped one of them, and the entire root ball fell apart. All the soil came up. It was just bare rooted.
Hmm.
Um, so I just sort of stuck it in the ground, and I cut off like I removed some of the foliage of the plant. I just assumed because it was going to be a sunny day the next day that it just wouldn't be able to manage itself with the roots being compromised like
Yeah,
that. So I mean, I could have just let it sort itself out. It would have given up some leaves, but I knew it was going to give up leaves anyway. So I just created this shorter, stockier plant that it's still alive, but we'll see what happens. But that's the same principle
yeah.
basically. Screw up the roots, remove some of the top. That makes sense.
Yeah, you kind of have to just think about that balance,
Yeah.
right? Either you're going to help it by cleaning up some of the top part, or you're going to let the plant figure out what to do on its own, and it will do the same thing
Yep.
if it has to. It's also why when we plant trees and so on in the ground, right? If a newly planted tree or shrub, if it's undergone a lot of root damage, a lot of times it drops all its leaves,
Hmm.
and people are quite concerned that it's going to die. But what it's really doing is it's saying, geez, I have the 1,000 leaves up here and I have a root system for 10. I can't support these leaves, but I have
Yeah.
to live. And
Yeah.
so it gets rid of the leaves for now until it grows a new root system, and then the leaves come back,
Hmm.
right? And that's just the way plants grow.
Yeah.
Right? Myth number 10, repotting should be done every year.
Yeah.
There's no such rule. Um, Now, is it a good idea? Well, maybe. But I think this comes again from this idea that somehow this soil that we're using gets old, right?
Mm,
So now it's a year later, we've got this old soil. It's time to get rid of it, give it some fresh soil. Um, but that doesn't really do anything, right? Fresh soil is no different than the old soil, so you're not really doing anything. There's really no benefit repotting on a regular basis unless you have a good reason for it.
mm,
So there are a couple cases that I know of that there is a good reason. So one is orchids, and orchids need a very, very porous material. In fact, they want chunks of bark in their pot. They don't want any soil. They don't want any fine stuff because that stays too wet. They want
mm,
mostly air, and the roots want to be up against something that's a little moist, right?
mm,
That's where they're really happy. And you can think about orchids growing on trees, right? That's what they get. Most of the root doesn't touch the trunk of the tree. It's just the bottom part touches it, and it's only moist, after a rain, and it dries out. So that's what
mm,
we want for orchids. So one of my rules of thumb is repot every 2 years. Now, you don't have to do that. You could adjust your watering and so on, but I find that the material we use, that after 2 years, it starts breaking down. And you get more and more fine material in there,
mm.
which
Right.
means that the pot stays wetter longer and it holds more moisture.
Hmm.
Right? Now, if you adjust your watering habits, it will live in there for quite some time. But if you don't adjust your watering habits, it's now getting wetter and wetter, and soon enough, it starts rotting its roots. Right?
Hmm.
So I use a 2-year rule just because it's a handy rule to have, and that allows people to just keep watering the same for the whole life of the plant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So they don't mess, just stick with the
Um,
routine and don't mess it up.
yeah,
Makes sense.
things like cactus, they don't have a lot of soil anyways. It's mostly sand and gravel, which doesn't break down, right? It
Mm.
breaks down after a million years. So they can be in the same pot for 10 years and they don't care. And they're just as happy as they were.
Hmm.
Now, the other reason I think people like to repot every year is because a lot fertilize. And this is something that I see a lot. People will say, well, my plant's not doing so well. What should I do? And one of my first questions is, how often do you fertilize? And they go, what? Fertilize? Well, yeah, you have to fertilize your plants regularly.
Hmm.
And so if you don't, what happens is you go out and you buy some of these soil that has a little bit of fertilizer in it, and your plant kind of survives for a while. And after a year, it just can't survive anymore because there's no nutrients in there, right? So you repot it into fresh stuff and suddenly it gets a bit of fertilizer and it's happy again. And you
Hmm.
think it was the repotting that did that, but it was just the fact that you have finally fertilized it.
Yeah.
So a better solution is just fertilize. In fact, I fertilize with every watering.
Just a sort of like a
And
diluted fertilizer.
yeah, and I mean, I had someone comment and says, "Well, I just put my tomato plants outside, and it's a really sunny day, and I have to water twice a day. Do I still fertilize twice a day?" Well, okay, maybe you don't fertilize twice a day, but a normal house plant, you're going to water every 3, 4, 5 days. Fertilize. You know,
Mm.
every time you water, give it some fertilizer, and they will grow so much better. And then you don't have to repot as often. Now, whenever we're talking about containers, we have to understand that um, the rules for containers and pots is not necessarily the same as gardens, because in,
No,
in gardens, we have real soil, sand, silt, and clay, and organic matter, and so on. And we don't have
organisms.
that in pots, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of, because we call it repotting and potting soil, I hate that word. I wish we would change that word because it's not soil. And we have to understand that those two things are very different. They're different chemically, they're different in the way they decompose and so on. So we have to think of those as two different environments. Some things are similar, but there are also some differences that we have to understand between those two places, right? So when I'm working in pots and I have a soilless mix, I have to supply all the nutrients because
Yes.
that soil doesn't provide anything. There's nothing in peat moss to feed my plants.
Hmm.
Whereas in the garden, I have all of this mineral material that's in my house plants. I fertilize all the time, but I don't do that in my garden. I
Hmm.
wouldn't, fertilize every time I water my garden. I
Yeah.
wouldn't fertilize my garden because it's getting nutrients from the soil. I don't have to supply them. Right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there must be more. There must be more like more life in the garden soil too. Like, um,
That's an important part, right? It's the organic matter, all the microbes are in there. You've got an established ecosystem of all kinds of insects and grubs and fungi and bacteria, and it's all in there. You don't have that in a pot,
mhm.
right? So we have to always remember these are two very different environments.
Yes.
And I find this happens a lot when I'm giving advice, online or in our Facebook group. We'll be talking about houseplants and I'll give some advice about houseplants, and then someone come along and say, "Do you really do that in your garden?" And I go, "No,
No.
garden is different. Those are two completely different environments. We have to do things different in those two areas."
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah. Another myth, sick plants should be repotted. I find this one very strange too. So I have some sick plant, and what do? Repot it. Somehow people think that the existing potting media, the existing potting soil somehow is making this plant sick.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people do this because they never diagnose the problem. They're kind of at a loss what to do, and they just figure, oh, let's repot it. Maybe some clean, healthy soil will fix the problem. Okay? That's very unlikely. if you have a sick plant because it has a disease, repotting is not going to remove that disease, right? The disease will travel with the plant. Even if you wash the roots off, you're still going to transport that disease into the new pot.
Mm,
So it's not going to get rid of a disease. It also doesn't get rid of most pests, things like mealybugs and aphids and all these things. When you repot something, you're going to bring them along. Now, maybe for the first couple of months, you won't see as many around because they have to rebuild their population,
yeah.
but you're bringing them along.
Hmm.
So it doesn't get rid of either one of those. So I can't think of any benefit for repotting a sick plant.
Hmm.
Does if this plant was sick because the potting media wasn't any good, then we have to fix the potting media. Simply repotting it in the similar stuff isn't going to do it.
Hmm.
So, for instance, if I had a plant that just wasn't doing very well because it was just too wet and it needs a more porous environment, well, I have to change the potting media. Or I have to change my watering habits, one or the other, right?
Hmm.
Simply moving it into fresh soil is not going to fix that problem. I'm still going to overwater my plant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So step one, always with a sick plant is you have to understand what the problem is. And then once you understand the problem, you have to figure out how to fix the problem,
Hmm.
right? And unfortunately, people never, they want to skip that first step. They don't want to understand what the problem is. They only want a solution.
Hmm.
So I see a lot of people online posting something, my plant is losing the lower leaves. What should I do? Okay. The question is never what's wrong with my plant? What is causing this? Which is the
Hmm.
question they should be asking. The question is, what should I do?
Hmm.
And then lots of people post an answer, do this, do that, do this, without ever knowing what the problem is.
Epsom salts.
Epsom salt, of course, right? It's probably the gardener's biggest problem, and this goes for house plants and out in the garden. And I think we've talked about this before, right? We have to take the time to understand the problem. We have to diagnose the problem. And to do that, you usually have to go and have a very close look at the symptoms, really understand the symptoms,
Hmm.
figure out what the problem is, and then decide what to do about the problem. You can't find a shortcut here.
Hmm.
You can't go online and get a what to do answer. Sorry, you can. You can go online and get all kinds of what to do answers. They're just not right,
Yes.
right? And I see that all the time in all the Facebook gardening groups.
Yes.
1,000 times a day, people get silly answers because they don't know what the problem is. They're solving a problem they don't understand. So
Hmm.
start with understanding the problem, right?
Yeah.
If I have a sick plant in a pot, you got to figure out what's wrong. Is it a disease, a pest? Is it the growing conditions? Maybe too much light, not enough light, too much watering, not enough watering, and so on. And I will look at the symptoms of the plant. If the leaves are droopy, it can be too much water or too little water. That doesn't really tell me, right? Droopy leaves does not mean water me more. It just means there isn't enough water getting from the roots into the leaves, and that's why they're droopy.
Hmm. So
But
it would be good. The good thing to do would be to tip that pot over and have a look. And it's like, if it's sopping wringing wet, oh, I'm overwatering. And if it's bone dry, oh, this is not holding any water, right?
turning that pot out and looking at the root system is always a good thing to do because you'll have done this before that, hey, these roots look healthy, or they're all mushy, or I see some pests in here. I see things
Hmm.
crawling around on my roots or
That's not
something,
good.
right?
Yes.
So looking at the roots is always good and just as important as looking at the above ground things. So newly purchased plants should be repotted right away. Another very common myth. Um, Now, this one may be a myth, but again, I strongly urge everyone to understand why they're doing something. So let me give you an example. You just went out and bought yourself an orchid, one of these Phalaenopsis orchids, and you brought it home. Um, I recommend most of them be repotted right away. And the reason is that the sellers, well, not the sellers, the producers of these orchids like to grow them in sphagnum moss. And that works very well in a greenhouse where you've got thousands of plants and you control the watering and they do really well. It will also work in the home if you learn to water them correctly, but it's very hard for most homeowners to water sphagnum moss correctly. It's either way too dry or way too wet, and usually way too wet.
Mm,
And what happens is you're enjoying the flower, and you're watering regularly and you're rotting all the roots. And before you know it, the flowers start dropping off, the roots are gone, your plant's dead, and you go and buy another one. Okay. I find homeowners, and that includes me. I've been growing orchids for what, 50 years now. And I have trouble watering sphagnum moss correctly.
mm,
So one of the things I almost always do is repot them right away, even in flower. And I've done a video just recently where I bought some, repotted them just to see how they would do, and they didn't miss a beat. They didn't harm the flowers and so on. You have to be a little careful to do that, but that works. Or at the very least, as soon as flowering's finished, repot.
mm,
Right? Um, for most plants, there's no reason to repot. Now, looking at the roots again is a good idea because that tells you something, right? If this plant is root bound and there's no soil left in there, it's all roots, well, maybe you should repot that one,
mm,
right? It's going to start struggling and it probably is already struggling. If it's really wet in there and there's no roots, well, I have to be a little more cautious about the watering. I have to grow some roots for this thing.
mm,
Maybe that's the kind of plant that does need to be put inside some sort of a container to give it more humidity because it doesn't have a root system.
mm,
If it has no root system, it can't keep the leaves turgid. It's not going to
mm.
grow properly. Um, So the answer is, do you repot a newly planted plant? Well, you shouldn't have to. If you've bought a plant and you paid full price, you should not have to repot that thing. That thing should be good for at least a year or longer before you do anything to it.
Mm,
If not, then they sold you a lemon, right?
right,
And you
right, right.
really can go back and complain. You
Mm.
really should. But you shouldn't have to repot these things when you first get them.
So, I mean,
Now,
I'm guessing a lot of people, they just have some pretty pot they want to put it in. But even then, maybe they should just put the thing it came in the pretty pot. Is that?
well, I think in most cases that's the best bet because this pretty pot probably doesn't have holes in it. So that's a big problem.
Yes.
Um, Now you can take a plant and put it in your pretty pot and just don't disturb the root ball very much. Okay,
Mhm.
that's strictly speaking repotting, but it really isn't because you're just moving it from one plastic container into another ceramic or plastic container. So
Mm,
that's fine if you're just moving it over. If the new one is a little bigger and you put a little bit extra soil in, that's okay too. You're really not disturbing the plant or the root system. You're not changing the soil that it came with,
mm,
right? So that's really the key thing. We don't want to do a lot of changes to the plant. Now, there is one other reason to repot, and this is a common problem. So you're growing house plants, you've got, let's say, 6 plants, and you know them, you know when to water them, you know how the pots feel, how heavy they get when they're dry, and so on. You're one with the plants. Now you bring in a new guy, and it's in something completely different. Okay, maybe everything else is in peat moss, and this new one is in core, which is a ground up coconut husk.
hmm
Or maybe the new one is in shredded wood, composted wood products, and so on,
mm,
and needs completely different watering, right? Um, and if you find that it doesn't fit into your watering schedule, you go to the window every Tuesday and water all your 6 plants, and this guy needs to be watered twice as often,
mm,
that may also be a good reason to repot. Put it
mm,
into soil that you know so that you're better able to water correctly.
mm.
Right. So that's another good reason to repot. Um, In most cases, you shouldn't need to do that though. But if it's a new plant, kind of keep an eye on it and understand that it may need a different watering schedule than your other plants.
Mm,
Okay. And if you have different types of plants and different size pots, you're probably aware of that anyways, because, bigger pots need less water generally. Smaller pots dry out faster. Taller pots dry out slower than shorter pots and so on.
mm,
Um, but just keep an eye on this new one and make sure that you're watering correctly. And if you don't like the frequency of watering, then you can change the soil to something you're more familiar with.
mm,
Right?
right.
Yeah. And so that brings us down to myth number 13. Potting soil should be sterilized. And I understand why people do this. They want to get rid of the fungus gnats that's in media. They want to get rid of the mushrooms that grow there, potential pathogens, on and on. Uh, I have news for you. There's no such thing as sterile soil. Okay. Now, we can sterilize soil, but the minute we bring it out of the sterile conditions and put it in a pot and put a plant in it and touch it, it's no longer sterile.
Mm,
Okay. So you can sterilize soil. The best way to do that is actually in a microwave.
that's
And you don't actually have to microwave it very long. So there is a recipe out there. You put a certain amount of soil, you moisten it because it's the water that heats up, not the soil,
yeah,
right? So it has to be moist. You run it for it's like I'm gonna guess 4 minutes, something like that. It's not very long, and that will sterilize it. And what it really does, it heats up the water hot enough that it kills most things.
yeah,
Now, to get rid of weed seeds, you don't have to heat it quite so much. If you want to get rid of pathogens, you have to heat it higher. Fungus gnats, I imagine you can get rid of fairly quickly. It needs a lower heat and so on. The problem is that once you take it out of there, it's not sterile. Okay. Any plant that's growing in soil, that soil is not sterile. You're not washing your pots well enough. You're not washing your hands well enough to make it sterile. Here's what I do, and I'm doing it for 50 years. Okay. I've got lots of old pots. I don't wash them. I don't clean them. I dump out what I don't want and then I stack them. So every time I get a so-called new pot to put something in, it's already dirty. It's got
mm,
the old soil in there. It's got, some old plant material in there. I don't clean it out. I just put new stuff in and plant, and away I go. Okay, I'm not worried about the pathogens. I'm not worried about the microbes, the fungi, whatever it is. Um, I'm going to get those anyways. Every house plant I have has some of that in there, and it's going to go from that house plant to my new house plant. Okay, so I don't worry about it.
mm,
Now, I understand people don't want fungus gnats in their house, so what some people will do when they buy new potting media, they claim sometimes they come with fungus gnats. I've seen enough people comment on it that there must be some truth to that. I guess if there's holes in the bag, the fungus gnats might lay their eggs in there and so on. So I kind of see that. You bring a new soil into the house and you want to get rid of the fungus gnats in there. That makes sense. But let's not call it sterile soil because that's not what it is.
mm,
As far as weed seed goes, quite honestly, it's easier to just let the weeds grow and pull them out. There's not going to be a lot of those.
no.
So I don't worry about it. I've never sterilized soil in my whole life.
I
Um,
noticed this year when I was doing my transplants, I did the microwave technique for some of them, and then one of the other batches, I just forgot to do it. So now they both ended up getting some that gross, nasty white stuff growing on the top. The one that was sterilized didn't get it as quickly or as badly,
yeah,
but the plants did fine in both.
yeah,
With all that nasty crap growing and the white stuff and whatever was growing there, the plants didn't seem to care at all.
yeah.
So
In
you're
fact,
right.
what I do with my plants, if I was say getting rid of a plant, I try to pull off most of the soil and I put that back into the bag of new soil and use it
Mm,
for the next plant that comes along. So
right.
I move soil from one plant to the next. if I can do that.
Everything's contaminated.
Everything's contaminated. The other one people worry about is damping off, particularly with
Right.
seedlings. So they want to
Mm,
sterilize that soil. Um, and I get that a little bit. I don't, but I might go out and buy some fresh soil and use that for my seedlings if I'm really worried.
hmm
But to be honest with you, the only time I've ever had damping off problems is when I don't run a fan and I overwater.
Yeah,
Mowing
I
them
agree.
properly, I don't get damping off.
That's
But the
right.
one year I didn't turn my fan on and I started getting it. And immediately fan goes on 24/7. Keep that fan going, and that pretty much eliminated it.
Yeah.
If you do get damping off, I find cinnamon actually works. It's one of the few home remedies that actually
Mm,
does work. And I just
mm,
cover the whole top, the seedlings, the soil, everything with some cinnamon. I think chamomile tea might work a bit too,
mm.
but cinnamon is just easier to use.
Right,
And
right, right.
and in fact, I've tried cinnamon on other fungal growths that I see, and it pretty much stops them right away.
Hmm.
So it is known to have a natural fungicide in them, so it's not a surprise that it works.
That makes sense.
So
But otherwise, just in general, too wet, no air, not good.
yeah.
Uh,
If you have a dome over your seedlings, take that off as soon as they germinate. They don't
yeah.
need high humidity, right? Uh, get them dried
Yes.
out, get the fan going, and you probably won't have a problem.
Yeah. It's funny how a lot of these transplant kits come with a little plastic thing you put on top, right?
Yeah. Yep.
I usually put it underneath because they're so flimsy. I need that for structure anyway. But yeah, it's and the thing that comes to go over the top, it's about 2 inches high.
Yeah.
So it implies that you should leave it on until the plants are 2 inches high, which would be, like you said, if you're gonna just, I mean, you don't even need it, but just to get them germinated, so you have to water them all the times at the top, you know. But yeah, it's implied that you should leave it on there that the plants are this high. But really, you're running the risk of damping off if you do that.
Yeah. The only time I might put a dome on or something similar is if I have very small seed that I'm surface sowing,
Yeah, like
right?
basil or something like that.
Yeah. So there's no soil on top of it. They're basically laying there, and one side is moist and the other side is in the air.
Yeah,
Those I will cover a little bit, and what I usually do is stick them in a baggie, a large
bagging method.
baggie,
Yeah,
and put the pot right in the baggie, just seal it. And as soon as I see germination, I open that up and get rid of it, right?
yeah, yeah,
But if I'm taking seed that's a little larger and I'm burying it and covering it with some soil, I never dome them.
yeah. You've got to 13. I got a couple of questions for you. I'm just curious since I got you on here. Um, so if you go to a garden center, uh, let's say you're going to do transplants. I mean, this is my gardening website, so we're always doing transplants, stuff like that. They'll have like special soil you can buy just for transplants. Um, and then they got the all-purpose soil that you can just buy for anything. And
Yeah,
then they've got like the cheapest crap you can buy at the dollar store. Um, and I got to be honest, I've used all three. I can get free. Like I got a sponsor, so I can get their best stuff. But I also just like to screw around and try things.
hmm
And I've had reasonably good results with everything. So what do you think? I mean, is it just the slow release fertilizer? Is that the value add of the higher end stuff, or the vermiculite, or what
yeah.
do you think it is?
So I use the same thing for everything.
I was going to say that is my wife buys this giant bag of stuff from Costco
Yeah,
every spring, and I usually end up using that for my transplants because that's what's around. On the like some morning when I'm in a rush and I decide to get things, I would do everything in a hurry, everything last minute, and everything in a rush. So I just use what's around. And I use that all-purpose stuff.
yeah. I use Promex
Use
because I've been
Promix.
using it for years. I don't use seed starter mix. I don't use transplant mix. It's all the same thing, anyways. A seed starter mix may be a little finer, so you could sift your stuff if you want. But Pro Mix is pretty fine already.
Hmm.
I use it for everything.
Right.
Um, the differences are a little bit in the fertilizers, but I fertilize. I assume the material has no fertilizer in it, and I
Hmm.
fertilize. So in fact, what I do is I get my fertilizer up to nitrogen at 100 ppm,
Hmm.
and most gardeners don't know what ppms are or don't know how to calculate them.
Hmm.
And so I made a fertilizer ppm calculator now on my website.
Oh,
Garden
okay.
Mess. So you can go in there and you go to put in the ppm you want, and it gives you a whole list of ways to make it. Teaspoons per gallon, teaspoons per liter, milliliters per gallon. It's a whole list of them.
Mm.
Tell you exactly how to mix it. And I
Oh,
grow pretty much everything at 100 ppm nitrogen.
wow.
You put in the fertilizer you have, the NPK of the fertilizer, how much you want to make, and it tells you how to make it
Oh,
up.
can you email me
Yeah.
a link to that and I'll stick it in the show notes here for my
Okay.
viewers.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Also, what
Um,
about so in my office, if I have any leftover coffee, I drink black coffee. So if I have any leftover black coffee and my plants are dry, I dump it in the plants.
yeah.
Am I doing, I mean, I've been doing it for years. I don't know if, am I doing the plant bad? Am I doing the plant good? Or am I doing nothing?
Most of the things you get around the kitchen, coffees, teas, the boiling water from your vegetables, et cetera, have almost nothing in them.
Right?
They're pretty much water. So
Right.
the water is good for your plants. The other stuff doesn't harm them and doesn't do much.
It's not, the other stuff is nothing. So,
Yeah, I mean, coffee will have, a very, very tiny amount of nutrients in there,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
it isn't gonna make any difference. But
Everybody
the
in my
water is
office says,
important.
everybody in my office, they think I'm like, what are you doing? Or if the plant looks great, they think it's the coffee. And it's just like, I'm just watering the plant. I'm attentive to the plant's watering needs.
Yeah. Now,
You know,
if you put a lot of sugar in your coffee, then of course the microbes will love the sugar because that's
yeah,
like
yeah.
candy for them. So the bacteria go nuts and you'll get an explosion of bacteria for 12 hours, 24 hours until they eat up all the sugar and then they'll crash and die off again.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's different kinds of pots you can have. You can have plastic, you can have stone, you can have clay.
Yeah.
And uh, I find so clay pots are the nicest looking pots.
Yeah.
But for the beginner, do you think they should bother with clay? So we all
Yeah.
have this image in their mind, these beautiful clay pots. But do you think the clay pot is a good pot for the beginner?
I think if you're going for looks, there are nicer pots than clay pots.
Right.
But it does have that traditional old-fashioned English gardener look, right?
Yes.
They did everything in these clay pots. So
Yes.
there is a certain look to that.
Yeah.
Now, big clay pots are hard to get,
Hmm.
right? I mean, like I'm talking, 2 feet across kind of things. They're hard to find. Um, they also can't take the frost.
Can't take
Okay.
frost. They
So
break.
don't ever put them outside over the winter if you're in the kind of zones we're in, right? So that's the downside. One of the best pots for being outside in winter is actually fiberglass
Mm.
or plastic, either one. But you can get some very nice fiberglass pots that look really nice. They're nice and light, and they stand up to frost really well.
Mm.
Um, I grow pretty much everything in crappy plastic pots. As far as the plant goes, it really doesn't care,
Doesn't care. Yeah.
right? One of the problems with clay pots is that the roots tend to stick to them. The little root
Mm.
hairs will go into the crevices of the clay pot. So when you do go to repot, you a lot of times have to do a fair amount of damage to the roots to get them out of the clay pots.
Mm.
Whereas in plastic, they slide out pretty easily.
What about, I mean, I find the challenge with clay is that it's a completely different equation for maintaining the moisture levels than
Yeah,
so I have a mint plant. I have a big 12-inch diameter clay pot in my garden, and the mint grows there because I don't want the mint, screwing up my
yeah,
garden. And it's a big pot, but when I water it, I take the clay. It's right next to my goldfish pond, so I actually take the clay pot and I stick it in a container, a big I have
Hmm.
this plastic tub that I use for putting weeds and stuff in, right? So I stick it in that tub, and I put about, I mean, so the clay pot is maybe 8 inches diameter at the bottom, and the tub is probably 1 foot by 1 foot, and I put about 4 inches of water in that thing when I just dump water in from the goldfish pond. Um, and then I go about my gardening, and then I come back and check, and all the water's gone. It's all
Yeah,
gone up into the pot.
right.
Um, so previous years, I'd had the pot sitting on the ground, and I'd dump water in it. And even though mint, which is the most indestructible plant in the world, the mint would suffer in that clay pot because I think
Mhm.
the water's just going right out, and it
Yeah,
didn't have time to sort of absorb in. But I find when I let it almost like swim in
yeah,
this bathtub sort of thing, it seems to make a big difference. But I don't think a lot of beginners would know that,
yeah.
about clay,
I
that
mean,
it sheds water so well and it dries out and I guess for a plant that needs to be dry, it's probably fantastic.
yeah. So clay does, it is very porous. It
Yeah.
didn't look that way to us, but it loses a lot of water out the sides. So clay pots always have to be watered more than plastic pots for that reason.
Yeah.
And that may be another reason not to use clay, unless, of course, you're growing things that like to be very dry, right? Then it's a perfect medium
Best
for,
thing to use.
like
Yeah.
for cactus type plants and some rock garden plants that like to be very dry.
Yeah.
It's a very good pot to use.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Again, I don't think the plants care. What's important is that we adjust the watering to the conditions we have and the plant we have, right?
Yes.
And clay and plastic certainly have to be watered differently.
Yeah. All right. Well, Robert, that was a great conversation on potting myths. I hope everybody got something useful from that. Sorry if we had some technical difficulties with connectivity here. I'll try to fix in the editing as much as possible, but these things happen in this amazing age of the internet in which we live. But otherwise, Robert, thank you so much for doing this. Everybody out there, until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Robert, thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks very much. It was great being here again. See you again.
Thanks a lot.